Hello there, everybody. This is Tim. You're in the right place, and we're going to start this week's show with a little bit of a longish clip from a really cool series that ran in the mid to late 2000s on MLB.com. It's called Baseball's Best Moments, and it's really hard to find stuff, but luckily we found this one very apropos to this week's episode as we go back 100 years to 1926 in baseball. Give a listen, and we'll see you on the other side.
Let's see who it's going to be. Going to be Grover Cleveland Alexander. Oh, Pete will come on.
The most unheralded in proportion to what he accomplished, in the words of the people who played with him and against him, is Grover Cleveland Alexander.
He had been a great pitcher as a young man and had to overcome a lot of physical problems. He was an epileptic and was a very heavy drinker, and that also could be a problem off the field.
All the old-timers I have talked to all my life put Walter Johnson and Grover Cleveland Alexander in the same category, the top two right-hand pitchers.
Alexander, some people think, the best pitcher ever. It suffice to say that if he was not the greatest of all pitchers, there was never anyone who was better.
I guess the most memorable thing in his career came very late in his career, in 1926 in the World Series against the Yankees.
The seventh game of the World Series, which is always a romantic event, is started by Jesse Haynes, a knuckleball pitcher. At the bottom of the seventh, the Yankees load the bases, 2 out. Haynes can go no further. His fingers are bleeding from throwing that knuckleball.
Haynes will be relieved, and I can't tell who's going to come in. It is going to be Grover Cleveland Alexander. Oh, Pete will come on.
He said there were younger men in the bullpen, fresher arms.
In the sixth game, he pitched a complete game victory to even the series at 3-3 for the St. Louis Cardinals.
This was a legend. Walking in, it's a gray afternoon, Yankee Stadium, walking in out of the mist. This was the man they believed in.
Oh, Pete will come on. The veteran Alexander will try to put out the fire here in the last half of the seventh inning.
And he got near the mound, and Hornsby walked over from second base, met him as he came in, looked in his eyes, and he said, "Pete, bases loaded, 2 out. Well, there ain't no place to put anybody as a Raj."
He'll first be faced by Tony Lazzari.
Rookie Tony Lazzari, hard-hitting, tough-minded, young second baseman.
Again, the runners take their long 2-out bases-loaded leads.
And he told Hornsby, "I'm going to pitch the first one, fastball inside, and if he hits it, it'll be foul." And Hornsby said, "No, you can't do that as a fastball hitter." And Alexander said, "If I put it where I want to put it, he's going to hit it foul if he hits it at all." And then Hornsby looked at Alexander and said, "Well, who the hell am I to tell you how to pitch?" And Alexander said, "Then I'm going to curve him low and away. 1, 2, 3. And that's exactly what happened.
Again, the runners take their long 2-out bases-loaded leads. He pitches. Swing on and this for strike 3. And that is all for the New York Yankees in the last half of the seventh inning, as All Pete comes in a situation that will go down as one of the most dramatic moments in all sports, and strikes out push-him-up Lazzari with the bases full.
Into the mythological books of baseball history goes Alexander and his strikeout of Lazzari, which a lot of historians like to look upon as the ultimate generational challenge in baseball history.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, here we go. My name is Tim Hanlon. How are you? It's Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be professional sports. I thank you for finding us, and certainly hoping that the new year is off to a good start for you and yours. What better way, frankly, than to celebrate the arrival of 2026 by, how about going back 100 years to 1926, when baseball had a hell of a year. And we're going to talk about all of that stuff with our guest this week, Tom Wolfe, who has a wonderful book, came out back in September, my friend from our friends, he says, at the University of Nebraska Press. It is called Baseball in the Roaring Twenties. And it really is a story of the 1926 baseball season. The subtitle is called The Yankees, the Cardinals, and the Captivating 1926 Season. As you heard there, a couple of interesting players will make an appearance in this conversation with Tom, one of whom is a guy named Grover Cleveland Alexander, who not only was the hero of the 1926 World Series, as you heard there, and we'll get into some of the specifics in a few minutes, but also some new and rising stars, including in this case that you just heard from the World Series, a guy named Tony Lazzeri, who was a bright shining star along with Lou Gehrig that year. And 26 is really an interesting year in baseball history, not only for a 7-game World Series that was, interestingly, was the first radio broadcast from NBC, then known as Westinghouse. The radio broadcast was the first time it was ever heard across the country. So that was an amazing thing there. But people like Rogers, Hornsby, and Babe Ruth, where there was an attempt to steal second base that ended the World Series. We'll hear the drama around that. But the Yankees and the St. Louis Cardinals had a hell of a series, but also just a hell of a year for baseball in general, not only Major League Baseball. We'll talk about some of those teams, including some that are no longer with us, which is, of course, always a curiosity, like the Philadelphia Athletics, now headed for, I think, Las Vegas, but we'll see. One of the first incarnations of the Washington Senators were part of that season. The St. Louis Browns, yes, St. Louis had 2 teams that year, and for a number of years. The Brooklyn Robins were part of that mixture, as were the Boston Braves, now, of course, domiciled in an office park somewhere north of Atlanta. But really interesting stuff we're going to get to. And it is a wonderful encapsulation of not only the 1926 baseball season we'll get into, but also, frankly, a nice, I guess you could sort of say, a pastiche of what was sort of going on in baseball and the Roaring 1920s generally. We'll talk about the Colored World Series, as they called it, in 1926. Rube Foster's Chicago American Giants, winners of that. We will talk about things like the jazz and motion pictures and the radio explosion. Guys named like that we know and remember and revere, like Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker, who were in the midst of major allegations of game fixing. We get into more of Babe Ruth's legendary story in this particular season, 1925. He was coming off a very less than Ruthian season. Most people thought he was finished and over the hill. He'd had some kind of mysterious illness that previous season, but he came back roaring, as we'll talk about, as well as new players like Messrs. Lazzeri and Gehrig, who we mentioned, and just an amazing time for baseball amongst the background of a roaring economy and happy days basically being here again, so to speak, in the 1920s. Rogers Hornsby makes an appearance. And we talk about all of it. And the book is terrific. Again, Baseball in the Roaring Twenties, the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the captivating 1926 season. It is available now wherever you get good books, of course, and you can find it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 427. You'll find a couple of convenient links to the various versions of such, I believe Kindle and hardcover at the moment. But you'll also find Tom's 2020 book, which we glossed over back in the day, which is an amazing story from 1932. Obviously, a different economic sensibility at that time. After this was basically the opposite of what the Gilded Age was in the Roaring Twenties. But it was called The Called Shot, with Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. An award-winning book, that the Seymour Medal finalist in 2021, and Sports Collectors Digest called it one of the best baseball books of 2020. But you want to get into that story too, you can also find a link to that book there. And I believe there's also, in addition to hardcover, paperback, and Kindle, also an audiobook version of that book as well. Tom Wolfe got a couple of really good books. If you're really interested in baseball from the 20s and the 30s, and obviously not a lot of film or audio for that matter. You could do worse than to get either of these two books from our guest this week, Tom Wolfe. Here's our conversation we had about the 1920s in baseball, in particular 1926. This was fun. The book is great. Hope you enjoy the conversation too. Please, as always, enjoy. Enlighten our audience a bit as to how you come across this topic and baseball generally. It's clear that you've got a Jones for certain stories and themes in baseball's pasts.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how far back you want me to go. I mean, I started following baseball when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and there was one baseball game a week on television, but I could listen to on the radio. I mean, radio was really introduced me to baseball. I could listen on the radio in my small town in Ohio and listen to Jimmy Dudley, who broadcast Indians games out of Cleveland. I got Ernie Harwell out of Detroit, Bob Prince out of Pittsburgh, KMOX. I listened to Harry Carey sometimes late at night, a little staticky, but it was terrific as a kid, growing up, to be exposed to baseball. I mean, I was just learning to read, but so I was beginning to read little orange book series of baseball biographies. I could read the sports pages in the daily newspaper we got. So that's how I got hooked on baseball. Basically, in terms of writing about baseball, that came about much later. As I think you know from my bio, the first baseball book I wrote was The Called Shot, which came out in 2020. And that was based on about 10 or 12 years of sort of research and thinking about how to write about a season and about Babe Ruth and the Chicago Cubs in the 1932 season. So one thing leads to another, I think, for writers. And for me, I didn't start writing book length manuscripts until about in the 1990s. I was in my 50s at that point. I did have a degree in creative writing from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, but I started really writing book length material with my wife, who was a law professor, and we wrote 2 true crime books, one of which had a little bit of baseball in it, in that it was about a prison in Iowa and a prison warden and a lifer that became friends because they were both Chicago Cubs fans. The lifer was serving he'd been in prison since his 20s. He was now in his 50s. But they were both Cubs fans. And the warden at that time made a promise to this prisoner that if the Cubs made it to the World Series in 1932, he would take him to Wrigley Field to see a World Series game. So I had started with this story of a prison warden and an inmate who were friends, and the fact that they went to Chicago to see Game 3 and Game 4 of the 1932 World Series, which is, of course, the Game 3 where Babe Ruth hit his called shot. And that's what got me started writing that first book. And then the research into Babe Ruth got me interested in Rogers Hornsby, because Hornsby in 1932 had been the manager of the Cubs all the way up until August, when he got fired in the middle of a pennant race. So Ruth and Hornsby didn't actually meet in the 1932 World Series, but they did meet, I realized from my research, in 1926. So 1932 took me back to 1926 to study that year and to talk about the Cardinals and Yankees in that season's World Series.
So seemingly many roads lead to baseball, but may I ask what your career was prior to this? Or was it related at all into writing, or was it something completely different?
I was related to writing. I graduated from college in 1969 and was a Vista volunteer for a couple of years on Long Island. I was lucky enough to actually see and go to Game 5, the deciding game of the 1969 World Series, where the Mets beat the Orioles. I was actually in the stands for that game.
Amazing. Nice.
Probably the most amazing. So I would say is the second most amazing sporting event I'd ever seen in person because I also saw the first Ali Frazier fight in Madison Square Garden a year or so later. Those were probably the two most distinctive sporting events I've ever attended in person. But
Those are two
um,
good ones for sure.
those are two good ones. Yep. And but in terms of a career, I went to the Iowa's Writers Workshop after I was in Vista, and then I worked as an English teacher at a community college in Illinois for 10 or 12 years. I met my wife in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I moved down here to Chapel Hill and worked for a company that did educational testing. And again, my job was mostly to teach people how to read and evaluate manuscripts. So I've had a long career in terms of writing, but I've only sort of connected it or conjoined it with baseball in the last decade or so.
All right, so tell me about the specific topic in this book, and I guess maybe we'll just kind of hone in on 1926 because that's seems to me where you hang a lot of the story is sort of around this particular season, particular World Series, sort of as perhaps evocative of perhaps a time, a decade, arguably, which is newly kind of relevant given some of the comparisons that have been made to what's going on with the economy in this country and income inequality and all that kind of stuff, the Gilded Age almost reincarnated in some respects. Why this particular period of time in baseball for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there are sort of a couple ways to answer that. A couple different things that appeal to me about writing about 1926. First of all, as you kind of allude to, that was one of the most colorful and dynamic and maybe important decades in our country's history. It was right between the two world wars. Um, it was, known as the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties. It was during Prohibition, although Prohibition wasn't really adhered to very religiously or very legally in many places. So the culture of the 1920s appealed to me. It was a time especially in the mid 1920s, a time of great optimism in the country, relative prosperity for people. This was several years before the stock market crash and the Great Depression, which people didn't really see on the horizon. So it was a time of, I think, great freedom and innovation. Motion pictures were being shown. More and more people were buying automobiles and radios. People's lives were pretty good, or at least they felt that in the 1920s. So it was a very positive era in many ways, culturally and socially. Um, we had through the 1920s probably three of the dullest presidents we've ever had: Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. But the culture itself, outside of the politics, was very vibrant. So so as a subject, I thought the decade was really important. And then there were a number of stories that I thought connected to 1926. As I mentioned before, first of all, there's Hornsby and Ruth, and then there's the Cardinals and the Yankees, because in the 1926 season, really, you have to go back to 1925 to understand how significant 1926 was for those two franchises, and I'll get to that in a minute. So there's this Cardinals and Yankees and Hornsby and Ruth, and then during the season itself, you have good pennant races in both leagues. You have a really remarkable story involving Grover Cleveland Alexander, who comes from the Cubs to the Cardinals and then becomes the pitching hero of the 1926 World Series. Got all that going on. You've also got something that I had never researched or even known about, which was this alleged scandal of a betting game fixing scandal that was brought to light in 1926 and that involved Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb, a couple of the better known players of that era, especially of the dead ball era. And as I did research into 1926, I realized what a significant time that was for Black baseball and the Negro Leagues. So I had several different storylines that I thought would work well together, all leading to the White Major Leagues World Series, which was a 7-game series between Cardinals and the Yankees, in which Hornsby and Ruth played, major roles, of course. But just to back up a little bit in terms of the appeal of 1926, you have to look at what happened in 1925 for both the Yankees and the Cardinals. The Yankees had started back in 1920 as a very dominant American League team once they got Babe Ruth from the Red Sox. But in 1925, Ruth had his worst season, and the Yankees finished 7th out of 8 teams. The only team they could finish ahead of in the standings were the Boston Red Sox in 1925. So sports writers kind of wrote off Ruth and wrote off the Yankees. And in the National League, the Cardinals were ascendant. Rogers Hornsby had become the player manager at age 29 during the 1925 season. He hit 403 that year. And again, the comparison between Ruth and Hornsby in 1925 is striking. As I said, Hornsby hit 403, Ruth hit 290. Hornsby hit 39 home runs, Ruth hit 25. Hornsby drove in 143 runs, Ruth drove in 66. So Hornsby's career, both as a player and a manager, was ascendant. Ruth was pretty much written off, so that 1926 became significant for Ruth and for the Yankees, because it was a rebound year for them that landed them in the World Series with the Cardinals and Hornsby, and it was the first National League pennant and the first World Series for the Cardinals. So a lot of drama. It all really started in 1925, and then the whole 1926 season, which was, had the various story threads that I've mentioned.
All right. Aside from the what you described, the sort of setting it up, and aside from the fact there are a whole bunch of teams that are no longer around or were previously domiciled that we love to obsess about, like the Philadelphia A's and the St. Louis Browns and the Washington Senators and the Boston Braves and the Brooklyn Robins, who we can't forget. Right. Give us a sense of what it's like to go to a baseball game during this period of time. The United States obviously is still kind of growing as it comes to sports, right? Still largely a Northeast and Midwest kind of sport per se, and that's kind of sports generally. Take us into maybe to the point you can. I know you weren't there, but what's it like going to a game in 1926?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to think about. Well, for one thing, it's the middle of Prohibition, so they're not selling alcoholic beer at ballparks. Were able.
Can you imagine? That's unbelievable. It's hard to fathom.
Yeah, they could sell peanuts and hot dogs and various things, and they could apparently sell a liquid that tasted like beer but didn't have more than 0.5% alcohol. But beer and baseball really do go together. They did before 1920 and they did after 1933. So, but not in 1926. So, what was unique in 1926, I suppose, from the fan side? Well, first of all, there was no night baseball, so all the games were played during the day. And of course, that impacted people who worked during the day, which was most of the population. But there was still, games usually started around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So there were people who could get to games, fans who could get to games after putting in a day at the office or working, as long as they lived in one of the major cities. And as you point out, the furthest west city was St. Louis, the furthest south city was Washington. So all 16 teams basically played in sort of the northeast quadrant of the country geographically. And because there were 2 teams in a number of cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, there were only 11 cities in which Major League Baseball was being played. So there were fans that followed the game thanks to radio and thanks to print media. But if you wanted to go to a game, you had to live near or in one of those major cities. And fans traveled. It was a big deal to be able to go to a baseball game. And I just think, personally, I know from my family history. My grandfather, who ran a small store in Indiana, would listen to Cubs games on the radio. That's how he became a Cubs fan. He was an immigrant, came from Germany in the late 1880s, didn't speak English, learned English here, but then became a baseball fan thanks to the radio. And he would, along with a couple of his friends, every year take a car trip from central Indiana up to Chicago to see games at Wrigley Field. So the game of baseball, I think, had this incredible nationwide appeal. It was America's pastime and drew fans from all over who could get to one of those 11 major league cities. And I'll just sort of add another sort of dimension to this in terms of fan experience in the 1920s. There were minor league teams all over the country, and there was good attendance and a lot of local loyalty to teams that played not at the major league level, but played in town ball teams, regional leagues, minor leagues, and then often in the off season, major league players, the stars, would barnstorm throughout the country, both white major leaguers and also Negro league players, so that fans who couldn't get to games in the major cities could still see major league quality baseball, whether it's black baseball or white baseball, in the South and in the West. So that gives you some sense, I think, of what baseball must have been like for fans in the 1920s.
Yeah, and also too, you're hinting at it, but the Negro Leagues were still fairly vibrant during this time too, albeit separate, but playing in a lot of stadiums that were inhabited by by quote unquote organized baseball when they were out of town.
Right, yeah. So and I mean there was integrated seating in some of those ballparks, but certain ballparks were segregated. So black fans who wanted to follow black baseball were able to do it sometimes, as you're noting, in what were white major league stadiums and ballparks. But yeah, it was a very vibrant time for black baseball. The Negro leagues as organized leagues, the Negro National League and the Eastern Colored League, really developed in an organized way in 1920, thanks to Rube Foster. And I do have a chapter in the book about Rube Foster and the formation of the Negro League. So by the mid-20s, it was a league that was very well established. They were not able to complete a schedule the same way that the white major leaguers were, because the black teams in the 1920s barnstormed at the same time they were playing in leagues. So the scheduling was a little bit off, but there were postseason World Series starting, I think, in 1924. 1923 or 1924, there was the Colored World Series. And I do have a chapter in the book about the Colored World Series of 1926, which was really an amazing series. And someone is going to go back and research that and write a really good book about it. But it's probably not going to be me. But black baseball in the 1920s is a subject that I think more and more people are going to study and learn about.
Oh, certainly. And the fact that these leagues were vibrant, and they had, you had both the Negro National League and the Eastern Colored League, and a World Series of their own. But you also mentioned too, I think it's even more baked into their business model, right? Was the barnstorming. It was almost to the point where you could argue that maybe the barnstorming was a little bit more important than the actual league competition, simply because they were going to be making probably more money off the top with those ample exhibition games and stuff. But so you're mentioning the setup. I want to talk about Babe Ruth for a second, because you sort of brought that up. Is that essentially 1925? If you were sort of reading the papers and following the sport and following the Babe's antics and stuff, that not much was expected of him in 26. And what happened that changed that narrative?
Yeah. Well, in 1925, Ruth had some kind of physical problem. No one really knows exactly what it was. He had some kind of abdominal issue. It's, sometimes referred to as the bellyache heard round the world. But he came to spring training in 1925 out of shape, suffering from this ailment. On the train ride back to New York to start the season, he collapsed in a bathroom in a train and hit his head and knocked himself out. He was carried off the train on a stretcher, went to the hospital. When he recovered, he just wasn't himself. He clashed with his manager. So all of this was probably a result of bad living and bad decisions in terms of his lifestyle. He was only 31 years old at this point, but the message apparently got through to Ruth. And in the off season between 1925 and 1926, he put himself through a kind of a physical rehabilitation that was guided by a guy named Artie McGovern, a former boxer who ran a gym in New York. And Ruth got himself in shape. And there's a terrific little video of people Google it, showing Ruth and Artie McGovern together. Ruth is about twice Artie McGovern's size, but more, Ruth, he ran, he threw a medicine ball back and forth, he jogged, he skipped rope, he lost weight, he adhered to a diet, he adhered to the training rules, basically, that Artie McGovern set out for him. So when Ruth came to spring training in 1926, he was pretty literally a changed man and a better athlete than he was in 1931. And if you go back and look at Ruth's statistics, the first 6 years he was with the Yankees, which included hitting 59 home runs one year, 54 home runs another year, these spectacular years that he had in his mid to late 20s. And you compare those 6 years of Ruth up through 1925 with the next 7 years from age 31 to age 38 through 1932, Ruth averaged more home runs and more RBIs per year in that second phase when he was in his 30s than when he was in his 20s. So he really redid his body and reclaimed his sort of position in baseball as baseball's greatest home run hitter, because of what he was able to do or force himself to do in terms of getting back in shape between the 1925 and 1926 seasons.
Yeah, and if I'm looking at my stats here, he led the American League in home runs, RBIs, runs, OPS. He kind of just swept everybody up. And it's interesting too, because I think too, and I can't, sort of place the actual dates and stuff, right? But I would imagine that around that time, and maybe coming out of 1925, I mean, you mentioned he was what, his early 30s, 31?
Yeah, he was 31 in the 1926 season.
But he probably looked a lot older than that. No?
Yeah, probably. I mean, he lived, he lived hard, and he drank. He was overweight. I mean, people sort of focus on the pictures of him. He had sort of spindly legs and the big torso. But he was actually, I think he was underrated as an athlete. He had terrific eye-hand coordination, and he had terrific powers of concentration at the plate. We'll talk later a little bit about his base running, because his base running is sort of a key part of the story of the 1926 World Series. But he stole 125 bases in his career. He stole home 10 times in his career. So he was a little better athlete than I think people realize.
All right, before we get to the series, couple other things that you highlight in this book that I want to just get your take on, at least verbally. You highlight a couple of new guys on the scene, and you kind of alluded to them before. in like Messrs. Lou Gehrig, of course, and Tony Lazzeri. Maybe a little background on these two guys and why they made kind of such a splash in I guess that was their each of their rookie years, right?
Second year for Gehrig. It
Got
was
it.
a rookie year for
Right.
Lazzeri in 1926.
That's right.
Yeah. But Gehrig had not blossomed as a star, and he was almost traded to the St. Louis Browns. The Yankees weren't really sure that they were going to keep him when he was a young player. The St. Louis Browns, in negotiating with the Yankees, wanted a pitcher rather than another hitter. So Gehrig, luckily for Gehrig and for the Yankees, stayed in New York. Gehrig's big breakthrough year was 1927, actually. In 25, he was a rookie. Of course, he played every game. Once he started playing, he played every game for X number of seasons. But then in 26, by midway in 26, I think he'd only hit 4 home runs, like at the All-Star break. So, or what would have been the All-Star break, half the season. Um, Lazzeri is a different story. Lazzeri is really an interesting fellow. I mean, he became a Hall of Famer, of course, but in 1925, he was playing in the Pacific Coast League, was a terrific power hitter in the Pacific Coast League, and he got the attention of major league scouts. He was under contract, of course, in Salt Lake City. But Lazzeri, there were two factors in Lazzeri's background that made people somewhat nervous about signing him. Well, three factors, I would say. One is that he played in the Pacific Coast League and he played a lot of games in Salt Lake City at a higher altitude. So scouts didn't really trust that his home run and power hitting would translate once he was down closer to sea level in major league ballparks. So they didn't trust the numbers, even though he put up spectacular numbers in the Pacific Coast League. Second thing was that he was Italian. And in the decade of the 1920s, there were only 16 Italian players in the major leagues. There was a kind of bias against Italians in the country as a whole. And some teams were just nervous about signing him because of his ethnicity. And thirdly, another thing that put some people off was the fact that he had epilepsy. He had never had an episode during a ball game or on the field. But at that time, people were very skeptical of people who had that affliction. So the Yankees took a chance on him and signed him in 1925, brought him to spring training. He had never seen a major league game until he played in one. So he was raw, and he was going to play second base. He would be the rookie second baseman for the Yankees. And I give a lot of credit to his manager, Miller Huggins, whose career as a player was at second base, for basically teaching Lazzeri how to play second base. And then the question was, could he hit major league pitching? And it turned out definitely he could.
Very interesting, and I'm almost a counterweight to some of the older guys in terms of the game. But that's the
Right.
beauty of it, right? Rookies and younger players, right? Kind of, yeah, making hay out of the game, and teaching the older stars how to do it, and maybe that their time
Yeah.
is nearing an end. All right. Well, one other area I want to sort of circle on before we get into the actual World Series, and it's pretty clear that that was quite a standout event for reasons we'll get into. But to you again, you sort of alluded to this, I think a bit, but I just maybe want to double click on it a little bit more. And I think this is timely given the resurgence, if you will, of issues in and around gambling and sports. The allegations of fixing against Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker this season. Maybe a little background as to what "quote unquote" gambling was like in and around sports and baseball at that time. Obviously, far different than what it is today. Illegal, if you will, but certainly a thing.
Yeah, definitely a thing. I mean, there's been betting on sports ever since there was sporting events to bet on. I mean, basically, go back into the 19th century, 18th century, horse racing, boxing. I mean, if there was competition where there was an unknown outcome, there were going to be people who wanted to bet on it. And prior to 1920, there was lots of betting on Major League Baseball, and players actually were allowed to bet. Players could bet on or against their own teams. All of this really up until the Black Sox scandal, which is the 1919 World Series, and then the hiring by baseball of Judge Landis to handle the Black Sox scandal. That was in 1920, and then Landis kind of set down rules in 1920 that that have applied, that still apply today, basically.
Which makes this story even that more remarkable, given what was set in place 5 years earlier.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's such a significant kind of pivot point for baseball and baseball culture in 1920 and the Black Sox scandal. And as you say, it's very timely today as we now see all the professional sports leagues kind of in partnership with the companies that promote organized betting, so that you have a whole array of new issues to deal with today that aren't really that new, because they were issues that existed all the way back at the beginning of the century. So the specific event, the specific issue that you're referring to is this game that was played. Just let me to set it up. The game was played September 25th of 1919. So this is 1 week before the Black Sox series started. This is Major League regular season action. The game was played in Detroit between the Detroit Tigers and the Cleveland Indians. The manager of the Tigers was Ty Cobb. One of his players was a pitcher named Dutch Leonard. The Indians manager was a player manager also, Tris Speaker, and the other individual who was involved in this was a player of his named Smokey Joe Wood, who was a pitcher. And Speaker and Wood and Leonard all had played together with the Boston Red Sox in the teens. In fact, Babe Ruth was one of their teammates also. So these four individuals knew each other, the two members of the Tigers, two members of the Indians. The game itself was played September 25th. The final score was 9-5. The Indians won. So 14 runs scored, 31 hits in the game. And the most remarkable thing for fans and for us looking back on it is that the game was played in 66 minutes. Now, why was the game played so fast? First of all, well, the Indians
that's without a pitching clock. Gosh, that's incredible. You can't believe that.
Yeah. I mean, both pitchers pitched the full nine innings, so there were no relief pitchers. And the accounts of the game indicate that the batters came up and pretty much swung at the first pitch, because players on both teams wanted the game to be over. Now, for the Indians had already clinched second place. So the game meant nothing to them. There were only 3 more games to be played in the season. But the game was meaningful for the Tigers, because the Tigers were battling the Yankees for third place, and whoever got third place was going to get some cut of the World Series money. The story that's told by Dutch Leonard, who was one of the 4 individuals, pitcher on the Tigers, is that after the previous game, the game was played on September 24th, Tris Speaker said to this group of four players, I know that my team is going to lose tomorrow, the Cleveland Indians, so we might as well all bet on it and make some money. So Dutch Leonard alleges that these 4 players, which included the player manager of each team, were going to bet, and they bet between $1,000 and $2,000 a piece, which was a significant amount considering their salaries at that time. They agreed to bet on the game because they knew what the outcome was. Now, after the game, what actually happened was that the the person who tried to put the bets down for these players was only able to bet a very small portion of the money, and he was only able to bet the money that he had collected from Leonard, from Speaker, and from Wood. Cobb's money never actually got to the person who was going to put the money down. A few weeks after the season ended, Smokey Joe Wood wrote a letter to Leonard enclosed a check with his winnings, and mentioned that Speaker was getting this check also. Ty Cobb wrote a letter to Leonard saying he didn't like the deal that they had talked about and didn't want to be part of anything like that again. And apparently Cobb's money never got put down. So you have the four players having talked about this game before it was played. The game's outcome was exactly what Tris Speaker said. The Indians would lose, the Tigers would win. Although Speaker, who played in the game, and his team was supposed to lose, Speaker had 3 hits, including 2 triples. So he certainly didn't do anything performance-wise to harm his team. And Cobb, whose team was supposed to win, went 1 for 5 with a single. So he didn't do anything to help his team, which was supposed to win. Now, nobody knew about this for 6 years. It was Dutch Leonard in 1926 who decided to expose this. And I won't go into the whole backstory there, but he had become very bitter towards both Speaker and Cobb for reasons the way he had been treated as a player by them. So he really wanted revenge. But he took these 2 letters he had in 1926 in the spring, took them to Ban Johnson, who was the president of the American League, and told Ban Johnson basically that he had participated in a game that was fixed. Now, there isn't very good or solid evidence that the game was actually fixed. And as I've just said, neither Cobb nor Speaker seemed to do anything in the game that would influence the game adversely or in the favor of what their bets were. But for Ban Johnson, who was president of the American League, he now had these 2 letters that were incriminating. And Leonard said he was going to sell them to the newspapers and expose Cobb and Speaker because he wanted to get back at them. If he didn't get $20,000. So basically, Ban Johnson paid ransom for these 2 letters to keep them out of the public domain, to keep them away from the public. This is in May of 1926. Ban Johnson just sat with those letters all through the season until September, when there was a meeting of the league presidents. And then he told the league presidents what Leonard had alleged, showed them the letters that he had, and the league presidents voted unanimously to have Ban Johnson turn those letters over to Judge Landis. So it fell into Judge Landis's lap in terms of how to deal with this in 1926, which is now 6 years after Landis had become commissioner. And he's dealing with a situation that happened a week before the Black Sox scandal. So that's an element of drama that I discovered during the research that I didn't know about when I started writing about 1926. And the resolution of that, which maybe we can go into a little bit later, the resolution of that didn't come from Judge Landis until after the World Series and after he had investigated and interrogated Dutch Leonard and the others who were involved, Woods, Speaker, and Cobb.
Were they essentially absolved?
Essentially, they were absolved. Landis wanted to interview Leonard directly and ask him, to tell his side of the story. He invited Leonard to come to Chicago to meet with him at his office. Landis's office was in Chicago. Leonard refused to come on the grounds. He said that people who go to Chicago get bumped off. He said it's a violent town, and he was feared for his life, so he wasn't going to go to Chicago. And of course, Chicago was, being run by Al Capone at this time. So Landis had to take the train to San Francisco, and then get to Leonard's farm. He had become a farmer after he was kind of blackballed out of baseball. Heard Leonard's story. then Landis came back and interviewed Cobb, Speaker, and Wood in his office with the media present. This was in December of 1926, about 2 months after the end of the World Series. All three of them said the game was not fixed, that yes, they had bet on it. That's what Speaker and Wood acknowledged. They had bet on it. They had won money betting on it. Cobb said he never bet on it. Cobb also said he never intended to bet on it, which was probably a lie. And there is no evidence really that Cobb ever bet. I mean, he was not a gambler. Speaker was a big gambler. He bet on horse races um, it was well known that it was not a surprise to anyone that Speaker would bet on a baseball game. So Landis eventually decided that the game itself had not been fixed, and that at that time, before he had sort of set the rules after the Black Sox scandal, at that time, it was not considered unethical for players to bet on baseball games. We can analyze why Landis might have stretched the rules or not wanted to ban Speaker and Cobb from the game. They were at the end of their careers. If he had banned them, as some people thought that he should have, it would have been a huge black mark on baseball. It would have really regurgitated the whole issue with the Black Sox scandal. It would have tainted, I think, the public's feeling about whether or not there was integrity in baseball games. So I think Landis, he didn't have enough solid evidence that the game had been fixed in terms of the players doing anything to affect the outcome. And I think he wanted to absolve Cobb and Speaker, especially because they were icons of the game. And they wound up playing 2 more years, actually. Um, not for their respective teams, for different teams, but um, it's it's a fascinating thing to sort of look at in detail. And Landis released the transcript of his interview with Cobb and Speaker, so it was all very public. Um, but you look back now, 100 years later, um, and think about what's going on in baseball currently with betting and with how that's going to be regulated or how it can be regulated, given given just technological changes, not only what the motives might be for players in this era to fix games or to tip off their friends who are gamblers about what's going to happen on a certain pitch or what's going to happen in a certain game.
All right. So in our remaining time, let's give us sort of a little cliff notes of sort of the dynamic of this World Series between the Yankees and the Cardinals. A couple of different through lines here. I think most people kind of just expected the Yankees after having I won't say dominated, but winning the American League, that they were kind of the prohibitive favorites, if you will. And the Cardinals, this was their first time ever in the World Series, but it went 7 games, and it didn't turn out sort of that way. What made this World Series stand out? I was doing some research outside of the book, and I think ESPN had done some listing of like some of the best World Series of all time, and I think they ranked it number 10 of all time. Maybe some insight into why.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. The Yankees were favored. They had been the leaders in the American League all season. They faded a bit at the end. They actually only won the pennant by 3 games over the Cleveland Indians, but they had a very powerful offense. They had a couple of really good pitchers. They had Herb Pennock, Wade Hoyt. Pennock especially was a really in his prime. So the Yankees were certainly the favorites going into the World Series. The Cardinals had been in a real pennant fight all through the 1926 season and trailed for most of that season in either second or third place. And then at the end of the season, the Cincinnati Reds, who had been in first place, just totally faded, and the Cardinals overtook them. So going into the series, There was one analyst who was the manager of the Brooklyn Robins, Wilbert Robinson, who did predict that the Cardinals would win the World Series because he thought they had better pitching and that they had better defense than the Yankees. But it was a 7-game series. The Yankees won the first game 2-1 behind Herb Pennock. He pitched against Willie Sherdell of the Cardinals, who was a really effective left-handed pitcher. And then in game 2, with the Yankees having a 1-0 lead in games, Hornsby pitched his 39-year-old Grover Cleveland Alexander, who also had afflictions because we'll get to Lazeri in a minute with the Lazeri-Alexander confrontation. But Alexander, like Lazeri, suffered from epilepsy. And again, like Lazeri, he had never had an episode on the field, but it was something that was well known. And the other thing that was well known about Alexander was that he was an alcoholic. And although he won 373 major league games, he had a real issue with alcohol. But he was Hornsby's pick to pitch game 2, and he pitched brilliantly in game 2. 63,000 fans in Yankee Stadium, largest crowd to ever see a World Series up to that time. And the Cardinals won 6-2, which tied the series at 1 game each. Series moved to St. Louis for game 3. There was an interesting event that happened in the middle of game 3. There was a rain delay. And during the rain delay, police officers from St. Louis came to each dugout with a ball that they requested players to sign that was going to be sent to a sick child in New Jersey. Cardinal players signed the ball. Then it went to the Yankee dugout. A couple of Yankees signed it. The ball went to Babe Ruth. And he not only signed it, he said, "I will hit a home run for you tomorrow." So Ruth predicted this home run for this boy named Johnny Sylvester. A lot of people know the Johnny Sylvester story. The game.
Yeah, I didn't realize that this was the particular game for all that.
This is the game for it. Yeah, in 1926, game 3 is when he made the promise, and then game 4, after the Cardinals had won game 3, 4-0 behind Jesse Haynes. And in game 4, Ruth homered not once but 3 times. So he fulfilled his promise to Johnny Sylvester. His last home run was over 500 feet out of the stadium and broke the window of a car dealership across the street from the street. So Ruth had quite a day there in game 4, which tied the series then at 2 games apiece. And then game 5, which was also in St. Louis because they were on the 2-3-2 schedule, also went to the Yankees. It was again a pitching duel between Pennock and Sherdell. The Yankees won 3-2 in 10 innings. The series moved back to New York with the Yankees needing one more win to clinch and win the World Series. Game 6, once again, Hornsby went with Grover Cleveland Alexander, who pitched a complete game. The Cardinals scored 10 runs, and they won easily 10-2, setting up Game 7. So we now have Game 7, series tied 3-3. We're in Yankee Stadium. And the pitchers for this game are Jesse Haynes, coming back after having pitched a shutout in game 3, is the Cardinals pitcher. And the Yankees pitcher is Wade Hoyt. The Cardinals wind up getting 3 unearned runs thanks to errors by Bob Musil and Mark Koenig. The Yankees scored 2 runs. So the score is 3-2 when we go to the bottom of the 7th inning, and the Yankees load the bases with 2 outs, and Tony Lazeri coming to bat. Hornsby, who's playing second base, comes in to talk to Jesse Haynes, who seems to be struggling. He asks Haynes what's the matter. Haynes shows him his hand and his fingers. He's bleeding on his right hand, on his pitching hand, from throwing his knuckleball. And Hornsby asks Haynes, "We've got Lazeri at bat, bases loaded, key moment in the World Series. Can you pitch to Lazeri?" And Haynes says, I can throw the fastball, but I can't throw the knuckleball. And Hornsby says right away, we don't want any fastballs to Tony Lazzeri. And he takes Haynes out of the game, and he calls for Alexander. He could have picked any pitcher, including Sherdell, who had pitched the day before. He could have picked any pitcher who was left to come in and face Lazzeri in this defining moment. And he goes to pick Grover Cleveland Alexander, who has pitched 2 complete games in the series and most likely had spent the night drinking before he came to the ballpark for game 7 because he wasn't expected to pitch. And this is so parallel in certain ways to the World Series we just watched with Yamamoto coming in to pitch in relief after having pitched 2 games as a starter. So Alexander comes in from the bullpen. It's a very cold, chilly day. Only 38,000 fans. He is wearing a red sweater. He comes in. He throws 3 warm-up pitches. Some people say he's hungover. Some people say he's in a daze. He throws 3 warm-up pitches. First pitch to Lazzeri is a ball. The second pitch is a strike. The third pitch, Lazzeri almost homers on. He hits it into the stands, foul. And Alexander is saved. It's a count of 1 ball and 2 strikes at this point, and then he strikes out Lazzeri. So this is probably the most dramatic pitcher batter drama certainly in this series, and in one of the most in all of World Series history. Because if Lazzeri gets a hit, the Yankees probably win the series. Alexander was really in no shape to be pitching at this point in this game, but he strikes out Lazzeri. In the 8th inning, the Cardinals don't score in the top half. The Yankees go down 1-2-3 in the bottom of the 8th. Top of the 9th, Cardinals don't score. So it's still 3-2 going to the bottom of the 9th. The Yankees at home, last bat for the Yankees. The first 2 batters go out. The third batter is Babe Ruth. So Alexander is now pitching to Ruth. Ruth is the last hope for the Yankees. They're behind by a run. The count goes to 3-2. Ruth takes the 6th pitch and walks. The umpire calls it a ball. Alexander walks in and makes a comment to the umpire. He said, "How close was that?" And the umpire says it was just outside. And Alexander said, "For an old fellow like me, you could have made an exception." So Alexander has this kind of calmness and sense of humor at this moment, which is kind of remarkable and an underplayed part of the story, I think. But anyway, Ruth is on first base.
And by the way, Ruth having the cojones, right, to kind of take that pitch, right? That's
right.
I mean, who knows what it was like, right? But still, it's it's dramatic right there. But it got more dramatic, which is this is the ending of this is just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and you're quite right. I mean, that is something that also has been really underplayed. That that was apparently a very close pitch. You think about Dale Mitchell taking the final pitch from Don Larson in the perfect game, a pitch that's right on the, just barely off the plate or right over the corner, but not swinging at it. And Ruth, who was an aggressive hitter, he hit 4 home runs in the World Series to this point, but he had never at this point in his career ever gotten a hit off of Grover Cleveland Alexander. I don't believe, I might be wrong on this, but I don't believe he had ever hit a ball out of the infield against Grover Cleveland Alexander. But he had walked in the previous game, in game 6, when Alexander pitched the complete game. So anyway, Ruth is on first base now. Bob Musil comes to the plate. Lou Gehrig is on deck. Alexander pitches to Musil, and Ruth tries to steal second base. Bob O'Farrell, the St. Louis catcher, who became the National League MVP for that year, a very underrated catcher, very underrated player. Bob O'Farrell throws the ball to second base to Hornsby, who tags Ruth out. The series is over. The Cardinals have won their first World Series. And this is happening in Yankee Stadium in front of Yankee fans. Ruth gets up out of the dirt, shakes hands with Hornsby, and congratulates him and trots off the field. The game is over. The series is over. The Cardinals are world champions. That's the end of it.
It's interesting because Ruth wasn't sort of known for, I think you alluded to it a bit earlier, for his stealing prowess. He was okay, but he was maybe at best what, a 50% kind of stealer and stuff. Um, but the sense that I get from your reading, from your book, and from the sources that I've been looking at, um, I think he was trying to go for the element of surprise. I don't think anybody in that stadium thought he would even attempt that, especially at that dramatic moment. So at the end of the game, that could, but it's aggressive and probably unexpected.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and Ruth kind of alluded to that later because he was, of course, asked about this. Why did you try to steal? Why did you try to steal second base on Alexander? And he had, I think, a pretty rational explanation. He said there were a couple of components of it. One is the Yankees had one stolen base in the 7-game World Series, and it was Ruth stealing second base in Game 6 when Alexander was pitching. So 24 hours before he gets thrown out and the series ends, he had been successful at stealing second base with Alexander pitching. The second thing that Ruth said was he didn't think Alexander was paying any attention to him. And that's pretty believable when we consider that Alexander came in from the bullpen and people said he might be hungover and he might still be drunk. Ruth seemed to sense that Alexander was just not going to hold him close. And the third thing that Ruth said, which I think also is important, is that the way Alexander was pitching, the Yankees were not going to get 2 hits in a row to drive in a run to send it to extra innings. And that somebody needed to get to second base to be in scoring position. And if Ruth was able to steal, surprising everybody, and was successful, he would at least be in scoring position for Musial, who might have then been intentionally walked, although he would be walking the potential winning run. And that makes sense on a baseball level also. So Hornsby said later that the Ruth's failed stolen base attempt was the only mistake that he had ever seen Babe Ruth make on a ball field. And Ruth was considered a very smart ball player. Again, something I don't think that's fully recognized. But I don't think that Ruth can be criticized. I mean, he's right. Alexander was just flawless in this World Series, 2 complete game wins, and had not allowed a base runner except for walking Ruth in his relief stint in Game 7. So it would have certainly changed the dynamics of how Alexander pitched to Musial and Gehrig if Ruth had been successful. And it took a perfect throw. I mean, Ruth was out probably by 3 or 4 feet. I mean, it wasn't that close, but when you look back even at the still photo of him being tagged out, it's not a stretch to think that Ruth could have been successful.
Yeah, hardly a dent though in the illustrious career of Babe Ruth, right? And it just adds to the color, right? I mean, if anything, I guess in hindsight, right? The close World Series, they certainly redeemed themselves. The Yankees did the next season by sweeping the Pirates, and regaining the World Series. But it probably just adds to the legend and the lore, right? This is a guy who, he was playing hard, right? This you could put it to today's gameplay and stuff and go, here, we got to win the game, right? This is like, there's no holds barred here. We got to go for it. And, if I think I can maybe put the element of surprise, get in a scoring position and have somebody like Gehrig coming up and then after, or somebody to get just a base hit, I could probably make it from here. That's not a bad aggressive thought process.
Right. I agree. I would compare it to football teams who score and then, have kind of a win or lose it decision on whether or not to go for 2, or kick the extra point and send the game to overtime, or go for 2 and win it right there. I mean, it's an aggressive play, and you're either successful or not, but you take a chance, and these are competitive athletes, and that's how they've gotten to the positions that they're in. And yeah, I can concur with what you have to say. And I will just add just an interesting side note, which I did not include in the book. I kind of regret not including this, but Ruth did face Grover Cleveland Alexander then in the 1928 World Series when the Yankees swept the Cardinals, and he homered off Alexander. But so Alexander's great heyday and the recognition he gets for what a spectacular pitcher he was in the World Series kind of ended in 1926. He wasn't nearly as dominant, wasn't dominant at all. In fact, in 1928, and you mentioned the Yankees in 27 and 28, where they first swept the Pirates and then swept the Cardinals, and the next time they were in the World Series in 32, they swept the Cubs, so they won 12 straight World Series games. And of course, that 1927 Yankees team, which is considered one of the greatest of all time, is basically just the 1926 roster. I mean, they didn't make any significant roster changes. So
with a chip on their shoulder to win it this time.
Yep, yep, and everybody having a little better year. I mean, I think Gehrig went from 17 or 15 or 16, 17 home runs to 47, and Ruth went from 47 home runs to 60 home runs, and Joe Dugan and Earl Combs. And I mean, that was a dynamite team, that 1927/28 Yankees team. But they were all there. They were all in place in 1926, but the Cardinals beat them.
So interesting but a good representation this season, right? Of what kind of the heyday of baseball and the country was going through and stuff. I suspect that there's probably some other series and some other seasons too that would sort of add to that. I guess my last question, in your research of this book and your writing of it what did you learn from this that you didn't know really going into this before, and that either validated or made you even yet more inquisitive about having chosen this season to be so representative?
Well, I would say two things. I mean, that's a good question, but a pretty broad one. And I mean, because I really learned a lot of different things, researching the whole season and putting it in context with what was going on in the country. Certainly, the amount of gambling and the Cobb speaker scandal was something that was very eye-opening to me. I didn't know about the Cobb speaker thing specifically, and I really did not know that there was so much kind of open gambling on baseball all through the early 20th century. So that was certainly something that I learned and appreciated it in a different way. And the other thing that I really learned a lot about was the Negro Leagues and the Colored World Series of 1926, and how 1926 was a kind of pivotal year in black baseball, because it was the year that Rube Foster, who had basically been the genius, really the visionary who had created the Negro Leagues, stepped out of baseball. He suffered from mental illness and was hospitalized in 1926. So his participation in the Negro Leagues and guidance and leadership was lost in 1926. But 1926 is also the first professional year of Satchel Paige, who became the face of black baseball from that year going forward all the way up to Jackie Robinson. So I would say that the gambling and black baseball were the two areas that I learned the most and developed a much, much deeper appreciation of.
Are either of those in your mindset for further investigation into writing, or are you kind of done for now with this one, given how long it took?
I think about other seasons. I mean, I would have to start doing some research into other seasons to see exactly what I would want to do another book on a full season. Took me about 4 years of research and writing to write this book, and I don't know really if I'm up for starting a new project that would take me into my early 80s before I was finished. So I don't know. I don't have another book in mind. I do think that there are a lot of seasons between 1900 and say 1932 that haven't been fully explored, and that there's a lot of rich material out there for baseball writers and researchers. There are some terrific books on 1921 season and 1908. There's a book called Crazy '08 about 1908 Cubs, written by Kate Murphy. And, there's some really good books, but there are a number of years. And I think the dead ball era, prior to Babe Ruth, some of those years would be really fascinating to research and write about. But I think that's a job I'm going to leave for somebody else.
All right, here's the last question. What book do you think needs to be written about baseball history based on the stuff that you've done from these last two works and your lifelong affinity for the game? If you had your druthers and you had a few more years behind you and you had the resources and, time was and money was not an object, what's the book out there that you would like to read that hasn't been written yet about this sport? Because you could make the argument that the sport is probably the most of all sports, right, in the United States, overwritten about, right? But there's a reason, right? Because it's the longest professional game in our history, and there's just there's so much to it, so much richness and tapestry and stuff. But what do you think's missing in the tome of baseball books?
Well, I would say that although some writers have focused on the cultural changes in baseball over the century, century and a half, that there hasn't been a really comprehensive analysis and exploration of how baseball has changed culturally and ethnically from the early days when you had, white Europeans playing baseball to then the integration of baseball in 1948, where Black players came in and were such an important part of baseball history for several decades. And then there's a kind of transition to Caribbean and Latino players who have been dominant in the late 20th century and early 21st century. And now we have this influx of incredibly talented Asian players. And I think someone could do a really interesting book, not about individual seasons, but about the way baseball culture and ethnicity reflects what America's path has been over the past 125 years or more. It's more of a sociological study, I suppose, but I think there should be more sociological and cultural investigation of baseball and maybe other sports as well, in terms of how they reflect what America's history has been.
All right, there you go. Our thanks to Tom, and a more intriguing book and set of topics you will not find than this one that we just talked about. Baseball in the Roaring Twenties, the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the captivating 1926 season. It's published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press, and it is two mints in one. It's a little bit of a history lesson about what was going on in the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, arguably the last Gilded Age that perhaps we're kind of sliding into in a sort of pernicious kind of way again. 100 years later, nothing seemed to be going wrong at the time. It was fat times and fun times, it seemed, and baseball was no exception. In 1926, where the story of both of those kind of zero in and overlap each other. That's what you're going to get in this book. It's not just Babe Ruth and the Negro Leagues and Rogers Hornsby, but it's also, it's sports gambling, for better or for worse. And it's the Jazz Age and Prohibition and all the various things that were going on to kind of evade that law of the land, so to speak. Really interesting stuff, and you're going to get both kind of intertwined into one. And Tom's a great writer, as you will also find in his other book from about 5 years ago, which is set in a little bit later time, 1932, in the early 30s, as a matter of fact, which is a far different experience going on in the United States and in baseball. And that one's called The Called Shot, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. Obviously, a far different economic and social kind of dynamic in the country then, sort of the hangover and the post stock market crash, Great Depression that was going on in this country. And again, baseball, symptomatic, I guess, of what was going on at the times as well. Both are great books, and that one won a whole bunch of awards. So that this one that Tom's got out now is probably in line for some awards as well. in the Roaring Twenties. So again, both books are available now wherever you get good books. Of course, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode number 427 with myself and Mr. Wolf, and you'll find a couple convenient links to the various versions of said books, hardcover, paperback. I think The Called Shot is also available in audiobook form. And of course, we have the links for you if you don't want to go to the website, right there in your little podcast episode description, right there, whatever device you're ingesting us with this week. So no excuse to avoid purchasing multiple copies for yourself and your friends and your family and their friends and so on and so on. Wink, wink. And of course, we get a couple of shekels of referral love from our friends at Amazon when you do that that way. We appreciate that. That's our little a little way of keeping our lights on, and we could not thank you more for doing that as well. While you're online, make sure you check out Tom's website. It's Thomas Wolf, WOLF, ThomasWolfBooks.com, all one word, ThomasWolfBooks.com. Find out more about Tom and his writings, and you can, of course, follow us on the various socials, wherever you might be following things. Well, why don't you follow us too? Maybe we'll lighten up your day with a little piece of information or a little photography from this week's current episode, etc. You can follow us on the Twitter X thing at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com and just about everywhere else, including YouTube, by the way, at Good Seats Still Available, all one word. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com, and our audio excellence this week is provided by our pal Jerry Payne, as it has been every week since we started the stinking little show, and we appreciate his knob twiddling this week as always. Appreciate your listening too. See ya next week and the weeks to come. Lots of fun and surprises coming your way, and we appreciate you listening. See ya.